예, 안녕하십니까. 여기 자리가 굉장히 이 공간이 굉장히 큰 공간인데 어제에 이어서 오늘도 굉장히 많은 분들이 와주셨습니다. 감사드립니다. 저는 미술관은 무엇을 움직이는가, 미술과 민주주의 이틀째 사회를 맡은 국립현대미술관 학예연구사 김경훈입니다. 만나서 반갑습니다. 국립현대미술관이 주최하는 국제심포지엄 미술관은 무엇을 움직이는가, 미술과 민주주의에 참석해 주신 여러분께 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 심포지엄을 본격적으로 진행하기에 앞서 오늘 미술관은 무엇을 움직이는가, 미술과 민주주의 2일차 진행될 세션에 대해서 소개 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 이번 세션은 주로 제도와 민주주의적 실천 사이의 역학관계에 초점을 맞추었던 어제의 논의를 이어받아서 오늘은 현대미술의 민주주의 재현, 초국가적 민주주의, 지역 경계, 또 재현 이후와 같은 단어들을 주요 핵심 단어로 삼는 오늘 둘째 날 논의의 전반부가 되겠습니다. 어제와는 형식을 조금 달리 해서 우선 전 지구적 자본주의가 기후 및 생태, 또 이민과 인구 문제에 관련하여 동시대 민주주의에 초래한 위기, 또 그에 적극적으로 대응하고자 하는 미술적 실천에 관해서 고찰해 보는 그 두 분 교수님의 공동 기조 발제를 듣고 이에 대한 질의 토론을 이어가도록 할 예정입니다.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to speak before you. I'd like to thank Sunhee Zhang and the director of the MMCA, the chief curator, the research and publication teams, and everyone who made this visit possible. It's an amazing conference. I'm really happy to speak. Among my fellow panelists, I'd like to also thank them yesterday and today. It's really exciting to be here and to talk about this really important material. Thank you all for coming as well. So I will speak about Blackout, Art After Democracy in the Age of Extraction. This essay addresses extraction, its visual cultures, as well as the politics and aesthetics of emergent forms of resistance today, in view of spreading sacrifice zones given over to resource mining, accompanied by exploitative international trade agreements and the finances of debt servitude. What forms do the cultural politics of opposition take? And how are artists and activists materializing the images and sounds of emancipation and decolonization against capitalism's rapacious commodification of everything and anything? With reference to the diverse artworks of Angela Melitopoulos, Alora and Calzadia, and Ursula Biemann, which variously consider geographies of conflict in such regions as Greece, Puerto Rico, and Canada and Bangladesh. So a really international array of global practices. This analysis considers practices that adopt an aesthetics of what we might call intersectionality, that in drawing a line in the sand both reveals complex causalities and effects and proposes forms of movement building and solidarity with those on the front lines of opposition. I'd like to mention the Center for Creative Ecologies that I direct at UC Santa Cruz. This is a platform to investigate these intersections between experimental artistic practice, activism, political ecology, ways of thinking about environmental studies, and the more than human realm. So if you're interested in this kind of material, which is very much emerging within the disciplines of art history, of cultural and visual studies, the interdisciplinarity that those fields name and describe, we're trying to amplify and develop these types of practices at the Center for Creative Ecologies at UC Santa Cruz. So my presentation has 6 sections. This is the first one, the withdrawal of economic value and political agency. Angela Melitopoulos' Crossings from 2017, an epic 4-channel video installation of 109 minutes shown recently at Documenta 14, presents an interlinking of people, matter, finance, and agency that defines a globalized political ecology of inequality and dispossession. It's hard to represent this piece because you would be surrounded by four video screens, so you have to try to imagine that in terms of the presentation. One intersection among several related others focuses on the financial interests arrayed around the industrial extraction of gold, copper, and rare earths from the Skouras mine in the Halkidiki Peninsula near Thessaloniki in northern Greece. So this is the area that I'm referring to that's outlined in red. Those exploitative interests connect directly to the EU-driven withdrawal of political agency from the Greek citizenry, as dramatized by the astonishing reversal of the 2015 bailout referendum by Alexis Tsipras of the formerly considered left-wing Syriza government in Greece, who was voted in explicitly to challenge EU dominance. The popular rejection of austerity economics imposed by Brussels as the condition of continuing membership in the Eurozone was itself rejected by the government at the behest of European financial demands, what Syriza former finance minister Yanis Varoufakis likened to neo-colonial gunboat diplomacy. So these two formations, broadly speaking, the opening up of Greece to transnational mining interests and the betrayal of popular sovereignty by treacherous EU politics, speaks to the global condition of extraction today, and they enter into direct correlation as well as conflict in Angela Melitopoulos' video, Crossings. In one passage, environmental activists are shown, and this is a still from the video, environmental activists are shown passionately protesting the wanton destruction of regional forests and rivers by mining companies, including Eldorado Gold of Canada and the Greek subsidiary Hellas Gold, and are brutally suppressed by militarized police. With them, we confront the widespread fact that police charged with enforcing law tend to protect corporate power rather than defend democratic will, as political disenfranchisement compounds material dispossession. Crossings visualizes nothing less than the workings of extractivism, the dominant, what might be called the dominant paradigm of advanced capitalism. According to the theorists Sandra Mazadra and Brett Nielsen, in a recent essay that they published, extractivism identifies both historical and current modes of wealth accumulation based upon the withdrawal of raw materials and life forms from the planet's surface, its depths, and biosphere in the production of financial value, which run in coordination with expansive political, economic, and socio-technological techniques pledged to its operations. Fundamentally, extractivism comprises a calculus of accumulation by dispossession, to use the terms of David Harvey, an accumulation without corresponding deposit, except in the form of waste, disease, and death, which transforms whatever it touches into economic value, whether that be mines, forests, rivers, oceans, or human and non-human life, employing whatever means at its disposal, including machinery, architecture, labor, finance, logistics, and media. And I was just in the museum, in the galleries, looking at the vertiginous data show here at the MMCA, and I think that exhibition deals with exactly this conjunction. Extraction also includes virtual processes, as well as dense materials. It includes prison labor and debt servitude, bioprospecting, genetics, and informatics. It drives real estate speculation and rent, as much as structural neglect and privatization, and bends policy and trade agreements to its will. Extractivism consequently designates a common motivating logic of institutions, universities, museums, corporations, and states, organizing their trade deals, social forms, labor policies, data mining, energy systems, technologies, and exhibitions. As a global formation, the new urban frontier is continually opening in diverse contexts, prompted by the appropriation and expropriation of spaces, values, infrastructures, and forms of life that are submitted to capitalist valorization. So I've been thinking about the symposium, and what do museums change art and democracy? And I think another way of posing the question of the symposium, if we wanted to think more on, from a skeptical or critical perspective, that's rather the dark side of what's happening these days globally, we could ask, what do museums sustain? What do they extract? How do they produce subjects for neoliberalism or even post-neoliberalism? We might consider an alternate title, How Do Museums Function in the Era of Post-Democracy? So let me show a brief clip from Angela Melitopoulos' Crossings to give you a sense of what she's dealing with here.
Signs and sounds of an epochal reconfiguration. Where are we going? What has happened? Here we are in a land of passages where various wars are crossing. Economic, strategic, racial, and sexual wars. A territory that hosts a double experimentation. The governance by destructive forces of debt and the control of mobility of refugees and migrants. We are not witnessing a clash of civilizations, but a war of subjectivities installed by capitalism. Those who struggle with the demons of national identity, racism, sexism, and xenophobia are facing the experience of departure, trials of poverty. They are the ones who have trust in the unknown. The wretched of the earth, who trek towards the different norths, are halted by frozen European subjectivities. In the chaosmosis of these times, they open possibilities that many others do not want to see, so they are surrounded by walls and shielded from vision. The imposed politics of debt is an economy that aims at the objectives of war, but with other means. Wars that are abandoning arms and military conflict. They become an affair of politicians, scientists, and even bankers. Wars that are not merely bloody, and the means of conducting them are not solely military. Economy, and notably financial economy, has replaced military means and gives rise to non-bloody wars.
That's a brief two-channel clip from a very complex video that, as you can see, deals with a lot of really expansive material. Part 2, War of the Worlds. While Melitopoulos' video may be focused on the case of Greece, the extractive logic it uncovers is pervasive increasingly worldwide in the global movement toward illiberal politics, authoritarian capitalism, and growing socioeconomic inequality. The current US administration is representative, where disaster capitalism and expanding sacrifice zones converge under its reign, linking political, financial, and natural resource exploitation to the overwhelming benefit of corporate wealth. It not only mobilizes disasters for further neoliberalization, but also proposes countless disasters in its wake. For instance, with little public support, the 2017 U.S. tax plan, recently forced through the U.S. Congress, lowers corporate rates from 35% to 21%, constituting a $1 trillion transfer to the wealthiest of our society. Just as the same governmental bill opens the Arctic National Wildlife Reserves to oil, gas, and coal drilling, with all U.S. coasts to follow. The maneuver joins the pillaging of public finances to that of natural resource mining, moving the U.S. toward historically unprecedented levels of environmental threat and economic disparity. According to this arrangement, again global in character, taxes are weaponized in asymmetrical class war. Politics become reduced to a massive police operation as multitudes lose faith in representative systems. And not surprisingly, economic structural adjustments are accompanied by the gradual withdrawal of civil liberties as activism becomes increasingly subject to control, repression, and illegality. I'm sorry this is a little dark, but this is the situation these days. In this antagonism that pits petro-capitalist states against environmentalists and indigenous peoples, from Greece to Brazil, Honduras, to the Philippines, Indonesia, to Russia, biopolitics, the governance of human lives, flips into necropolitics, the administration of death, and scales up and down to what we could call geontopolitics, the governance of the relations between life and non-life, constituting an ascendant politics of earth being in our age of extraction. Such is clear, for instance, with the indigenous uprising called Standing Rock in the US in 2016, figuring as one hyper-visible focal point of the expansive conflict zone, setting grassroots movements in opposition to petro-capitalist developments known as Blockadia. There, members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the US indigenous nation, joined by other indigenous peoples and countless allies, challenged the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, expressing popular resistance to extraction, or at least one version of it, including resistance both to the exploitation of fossil fuels, placing natural environments and water sources at risk, and to the negation of indigenous rights in the face of ongoing neo-colonial land grabs and domineering state sovereignty. Yet the event also centered around the corporate government complex's enforcement of its management of the difference between life and non-life, especially when it comes to oil and water. When water protectors, as they called themselves, insisted upon mini wachoni, or water is life, or water is alive in Dakota, in the face of militarized police advances and private security assaults, shielded bulldozers, and gas attacks. The event constituted both a biopolitical rift over human rights and a geontopolitical challenge to the neoliberal logic whereby elements, environments, and non-human life forms are violently reduced to commodities within the unfolding drama of its ecologically devastating and climate-changing economy of accumulation by dispossession. With such events, we witness the delegitimizing of liberal electoral politics, merged with corporate corruption, at a time when contemporary politicians increasingly flirt with neo-fascist, alt-right formations. Yet there's also been a growing intensity of thinking and living politically outside that domain, as at Standing Rock, which is to say in the civic realms of culture and the arts, as well as activism, right? Where the politico-aesthetic imagination asserts itself in really interesting ways and challenges petrocapitalist extractivism. In proliferating instances, aesthetic practices themselves modulate or transform within this geopolitical framework. The artistic blurs with social movements, producing an expanded field of aesthetics with cosmopolitical scope, focused on the formation of liberated values, joined in contexts where nothing less is at stake than a contemporary war of the worlds. Against the extractivist logic of what we might call the capitalocene, a world sacrificing the earth itself to the interests of short-term capitalist profits. That's an alternative to the Anthropocene. Artists and activists, as well as communities set on doing politics differently, are restoring and inventing alternative forms of life and creating modes of ethical being in common that are drawing on existing wisdoms and proposing new knowledges, remaking the world as we know it in both representation and practice. So I want to consider briefly 3 such examples that I see where this is operative. The artwork of Angela Melitopoulos, Ursula Biman, and Alora and Calzadilla, which cover a spectrum of cultural practices referencing and intervening in diverse sites in the global north and south. Of course, we could select many others, but these are 3 interesting case studies. Their practices include political documentary, speculative analysis linked to insurrectionary social movements, and even gallery-bound, sculptural and audiovisual experiments, which all give form to socio-political and environmental violence, as well as to inspiring sites of resistance. Governing by debt. Crossings places viewers uncomfortably in the crossfire of its 4 large screens, constructing an audiovisual confrontation approximating its war zone geography. While the video provides interviews with Greek environmental activists who discuss the political and ecological stakes of their struggle, the piece also expands that rift zone to Greece's refugee crisis, including the views of migrants interned at the Idomeni camp, located north of Thessaloniki, and at the Moria camp on the island of Lesbos, just off of Turkey's coast. Migrants speak in the video of deteriorating conditions in their home countries, such as Turkey and Syria and Iraq. It becomes clear that migration is itself symptomatic of the social breakdown in the face of political authoritarianism, economic inequality, and environmental military violence. In other words, the very extractivist order that has had such devastating effects on homelands in the Middle East and Africa. Asylum seekers tell of desperate conditions also in the camps, the cruelty of police and guards, and the interminable waits that make their experience of dislocation allegedly worse than being in places like war-torn Afghanistan. While some circumstances explain the many protests against camp conditions and migration policies, some of which are shown in Crossings, Melitopoulos' video also sees in them contemporary echoes of slave rebellions of ancient times, set in the same region that was also mined then by forced labor more than 2,000 years ago, and led to rebellions that just as now materialized demands for political transformation. Crossings also includes interviews with refugee camp inhabitants who are members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which continues to defend autonomous zones beyond state sovereignty in northern Syria and Turkey. They discuss their revolutionary politics and affirmatively pro-feminist culture, as well as their support for Kurdish leader and PKK founder Abdullah Öcalan, who was remarkably influenced by U.S. social ecologist Murray Bookchin and his 1960s and 70s anarchist theories of libertarian municipalism and environmental well-being. Just as one older Halkidiki-based anti-mining activist is shown admitting his hopelessness regarding conventional political transformation in the current EU system, speculating that violent resistance may be the only remaining response in Greece, PKK refugee camp residents sing songs in praise of revolutionary guerrillas set to the Greek bouzouki. In the brutal conditions of war fought by economic means, where debt is a weapon of mass destruction, and migration a descent into powerlessness. Life, it appears, must be defended by any means necessary. Such militant convictions leads crossings to its conclusion, its one speculative conclusion. If democratic voting offers no or little effective means of political ecological phase shift, whether in ancient slaveholding states of patriarchal imperialism or in today's post-neoliberal unfolding of authoritarian capitalism, then maybe we need to look beyond electoral politics for ways of reclaiming justice, equality, and environmental livability, inventing new solidarities on that basis. Similarly, advancing a relational geography's approach to global petrocapitalist extraction is the work of Ursula Biemann and her short video, Deep Weather, from 2013, which begins by depicting the topography of Canada's Albertan tar sands, one of the greatest sources of climate disasters on the planet. On the grounds of what was a pristine boreal forest, corporations have industrialized an area of roughly the size of England, mining dirty and hard-to-access hydrocarbons in the form of bitumen, a heavy black oil mixed with clay, sand, and water, and in the process of clearing the forest biodiverse ecology, denigrated as overburden by the mining industry in order to prioritize what Biemann calls carbon geologies. Extraction firms such as ConocoPhillips, Petro-Canada, and ExxonMobil have brought ruin to the environment and heavily impacted the lives of First Nations peoples. Let me just play a brief clip from her video.
The Athabasca River flows north through Alberta into the Arctic Ocean. It feeds vast boreal forests and wetlands and the native trappers and hunters who live on the game. The oil miners arrived and began to dig out the tar sands in an area the size of England. They lay out the seismic lines across the land to sense the depths of the summer waves for steam-assisted gravity drainage of the tar deposits in deeper layers. Day and night they mine the black sediments and boil the Athabasca water to separate the tar from the clay. The toxic fluids collect in lakes, where rhythmic explosions keep the birds from bathing in acid.
Okay, that's the first part of the video. And in the second part, she focuses on areas in Bangladesh, on the Delta, areas that are already suffering from the ongoing conditions of environmental transformation today with sea level rise that is throwing potentially millions of people into precarious situation where they're losing their homes. And she portrays this in the second half of the video, showing people who are carrying bags packed with clay to build up the barriers against the rising seas in this area of Bangladesh's coastal zone. So you can see that, in other words, the industrial developments in the north, such as in Canada and the Albertan tar sands, are leading already today to disastrous conditions of environmental transformation that are threatening people's lives in current-day South Asia. Much could be said about many areas of coastal zones worldwide that are now experiencing the conditions of growing sea level rise under the catastrophe of climate breakdown. This is the area of the Bay of Bengal that Ursula Biemann is focusing on. Okay, 5, disaster capitalism. An alternative to the largely documentary approaches of Melitopoulos and Biemann, Jennifer and Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla and their recent work assembles an audiovisual and sculptural poetics drawing together politics and ecology, particularly as materialized in the scars of past and ongoing extractive violence in the context of in this case, Puerto Rico. Theirs is an intersectionalist aesthetic formed of fragmented machinery and industrial architecture, drawn from sites of international trade, transportation infrastructure, and energy generation. Consider their sculptural piece called Blackout from 2017, which presents a large section of an electromagnetic power transformer that exploded and led to a massive power failure, a blackout, in Puerto Rico in 2016. It's one of many that has plagued the island in recent years. The fragments of ceramic insulators and transformer coils were sourced from the Aguirre power plant, this place in Salinas, part of Puerto Rico, where you see the red pointer, right in the middle of the Caribbean, among the many other islands in that area. So it was taken from the Puerto Rican Electric Authority. Hobbled by the recent 2017 hurricane season, the electricity system was scandalously still offline months later, even still to this day, for the majority of people on the island. Chronically underfunded as a national utility set up in 1941 and nominated recently for privatization, PREPA, or the Puerto Rican Electric Authority, is also one of the largest bond issuers responsible for the island's current and growing $74 billion debt. So Blackout, the sculptural piece, draws these strands together, giving creative form to the joining of debt servitude and energy production. Creditors of the island's debt include U.S. investment firms and vulture hedge funds, profiting by recuperating dues, even if they come at the expense of brutal structural adjustments, not dissimilar to the debt subjection of Greece. Consequently, Puerto Rico's economy, controlled currently by an unelected Financial Management and Oversight Board appointed by the U.S. Congress in 2016, siphons resources from public schools and the country's public university system, from hospitals, pensions, and infrastructure, and redirects them to creditors, basically investors in the U.S., in the mainland U.S., effectively placing profits over people. The result is what some call a debt prison, exacerbated by the island's environmental misfortunes. More, the island's economic configuration, implemented over decades of U.S. policy and constitutional law, excludes the option currently available to U.S. cities and corporations in financial duress of declaring bankruptcy, which provides legal protection, and prioritizes loan repayments over social welfare expenditures. So it's a site of massive extraction. The frayed and mangled and corroded body of Alora and Calzadia's resonant sculpture, for me, presents a state of material decomposition that sources this depraved politico, financial, and environmental network, embodying precisely these unjust economic distortions and structural disfigurements and legal maladjustments. So they become material. Some activists believe the overwhelming debt, approximately $123 billion when factoring in the country's $49 billion pension burden, is simply unserviceable, demanding forgiveness or economic development first, though the Oversight Board, which is beholden to corporate stakeholders, will likely continue to do everything in its powers to guarantee immediate repayment before all else. Still others contend that with ever more multitudes subjected to politico-economic disenfranchisement in a world of growing resource inequality, dramatized particularly in the post-disaster zones of Houston in the US or Puerto Rico, as in this case where you see a woman whose house was basically blown away by the hurricane, or Detroit or New Orleans or Haiti or any number of places, I'm thinking only in the Americas here. These sites form an interconnected field of structural and purposeful neglect, as we're witnessing a spreading blackout that is socioeconomic and structurally also racist in origin. Indeed, for the philosopher Achille Mbembe, it represents the geographical expansion of the centuries-long conditions of profound inequity, once characterizing primarily the slavery of those of African origin. But now, according to Mbembe, it's called precarity and released from strictly racial classification, though this isn't to say that racial capitalism doesn't still persist. But we face what Mbembe terms the becoming black of the world. The phrase designates the globalized blackout of impoverishment, necropolitics, and dispossession, the dispossession of the power of self-determination, of control over one's future, even the very free access to time and the possible. To Mbembe's diagnosis of this new norm of precarious existence, I want to add the definition of blackout. I want to add to this definition the exposure to extractions, waste zones, befouled elements, colonized atmospheres, toxic externalities, and public health emergencies, where becoming black and blackout is evidenced in urban pollution, degraded water, mismanaged waste, and indebted and diseased, imprisoned bodies. While its zones may be expanding globally, exposure is still based on differential vulnerabilities and unequal resources of protection, with the interconnected relations between the two inspiring further cycles of commodification, as with healthcare, education, and housing becoming privatized, as much as the primary elements of water, air, and soil. To these dynamics, Alora and Calzadilla add a sonic dimension. And I'll just speak while the video plays. Transforming Blackout's transformer into a tuning device for a vocal acoustic performance based on an original score of the composer David Lane that begins with a quotation by the US founding father, Benjamin Franklin. Maybe we need the volume up a little bit here. So they're playing with this quote that reads, in going on, and this is in earlier English, right? In going on with these experiments, how many pretty systems do we build, which we soon find ourselves obliged to destroy? If there is no use discovered of electricity, which Benjamin Franklin helped to discover, this, however, is something, which we soon find, this, however, is something considerable, that it may help to make a vain man humble. It's a little bit of an awkward, for us, earlier historical English. The irony is, of course, that this humbling of man that Benjamin Franklin speaks about has been far from the case. Even in the shadow of multiple power failures, including the recent ones following 2017's summer of disaster in the Americas, the burned-out massive infrastructure on the island still inspires yet more visions of potential economic use. Can we cut the sound now? So you get a sense of that. They're trying to turn this expression of neoliberal entrepreneurialism, basically, sourced in the work of one of US's early inventors. They're trying to transform it into a liberatory or emancipatory possibility through song. But nevertheless, out of the ashes emerge ever greater machinic monsters of wealth accumulation and the expansion of disaster capitalism, as catastrophe offers further opportunities for advancing ever more intense neoliberal and extractive agendas. That's what we're having to contend with today. Okay, finally, in my last section, Hope in the Dark. I'm trying to now see what is possible within these conditions. So with these projects by Melitopoulos, Biman, and Alora and Calzadilla, we encounter diverse approaches to extractive zones, where, as we've seen, exploitation simultaneously implicates natural resources and finances, social and economic violence. These techniques include earth-moving machinery, as well as operational logistics, trade agreements, as well as legal arrangements, police brutality and coercive economics, tax evasion, and offshore accounts, even while the projects tend to focus on community-scale geographies of the human and environmental costs. Nevertheless, these sacrifice zones formed at the intersection of extreme weather events, environmental de- or non-regulation, and creditor-debtor inequalities, also offer scenes, arguably, of hope in the dark, as defined by the US-based writer Rebecca Solnit, meaning acts of non-exploitative mutual aid, as when, in the absence of state or NGO assistance, neighbors, community members come to each other's support. They form collective kitchens or offer disaster relief, distribute essential services, or rebuild homes and save lives. Perhaps most directly portrayed in Deep Weather, and its account of Bangladeshis fortifying their coastlines against storm surges. Such practices also occur in the community building and self-organized education, political education, in Greece's refugee camps, and in Puerto Rico's post-hurricane geographies of self-management, for instance, in these collective gardens and farming operations where people are trying to produce their own food for community use. And more broadly translated as, in the Spanish, autogestión, or self-directed becoming, which is speculatively schematized in Aloran Calzadia's film, which I don't have time to talk about, but what represents, in this film called The Night We Became People Again, they refer to pre-colonial Taino cosmologies, so indigenous cosmologies, set in a mythological cave that you see a still from here, that for them represents the origin site of the world and converges with a post-colonial imaginary of infrastructural breakdown and collective reinvention, making possible a new configuration of post-anthropocentric, post-extractive social being. I know that's quite complex, but I encourage you to explore these projects further beyond this presentation. So these practices reveal emergent spaces of potentiality, one suggesting or even building toward a politico-ecological paradigm shift, toward a self-governing movement, overcoming the privations and manipulations of disaster capitalism. They even enliven modes of disaster communalism, or what we might call disaster communism, as Ashley Dawson has recently phrased it. He means collaborative, altruistic, and often improvised forms of collective provision, echoing Marx's dictum, for each according to ability, to each according to need. These forms offer glimpses of new horizons of the possible, and by insisting on the ethical imperative of collective survival, they extend beyond loyalty to capitalism in expressing the dreams of decolonial transformation and emancipatory revolution, even while they also hold within their critical historical consciousness understandings of the way that communism and socialism itself have been derailed into authoritarianism in the past. So if so, then in these areas of disaster communism or communalism, emerging in the blackouts of the energy grid following extreme weather events, we also witness a flip of Mbembe's term becoming black as a modality of decolonized subjectivization, a building of unrecognizable and ungovernable sovereignties, of prefigurative post-capitalist mutual aid societies, which await their connection and scaling upwards toward transnational solidarities and a coming movement of movements. As with the mobilizations at Standing Rock threatened with the blacking out of its water sources, these are spaces where blackout potentially transforms into positive expression, discontent with pessimism, where blackness, according to Mbembe, becomes a symbol of beauty and pride, a sign of radical defiance, a call to revolt, desertion, and insurrection. Indeed, in such places we can discern an island of repose in the midst of racial oppression and objective dehumanization. That said, are these instances of volunteerist social formations emerging in disaster zones, in colonized Greece, flood risk Bangladesh, and post-hurricane Puerto Rico, not also symptomatic of neoliberal entrepreneurialism in the vacuum of defunded, indebted states, where self-organization operates as self-extracting cheap or unpaid labor, conveniently relieving the state of its responsibilities? Are these instances where recovery ultimately means the return to capitalism's status quo and to even more extreme versions, to its deepest dependent sovereignties and unquestioned hegemony? If so, at what point do such collective efforts catalyze social transformation beyond extractive capture, where blackout might designate radical degrowth economies, ecological downsizing, hope not only in the dark but also of the dark, an obscurity or strategic opacity, resistant to surveillance, algorithmic capture, and media spectacle alike? It's difficult to answer these questions and to clearly separate hope from despair, especially when the topologies of revolt and normalization, desertion and capture are so complexly intertwined, and where the effects and outcomes of these events are never simply punctual and secure. What is clear, in conclusion, is that we need a transnational movement answering and preempting the current distributive globalization of financial power, operating within and between nation states that no longer function solely according to the logics of democratic representation and accountability, as is shown in Melitopoulos' Crossings. The author Jerome Roos writes, ultimately, the only way to begin dismantling imperialist relations of domination and truly liberate the new debt colonies from their economic subjugation is for the working classes and social movements of both the debtor and the creditor countries to become aware of their shared interests in building a unified front against the impositions of global finance. It's exactly this need for internationalist solidarities that the work of the above artists and activists show is pressing. In them, we see some of the transnational social energies uniquely capable of challenging and transforming petrocapitalist systems of governance, despite all. In these blackouts, in other words, of fossil and financial power, we see the signs of radical defiance, a call to revolt, desertion, and insurrection. Thank you very much.